Science fiction is often approached as narrative, metaphor, or speculation. In this analysis, it is treated differently, as system design. Each film constructs a world governed by explicit rules, operational constraints, and predictable outcomes, independent of character or emotion. This video examines how those worlds function internally. It focuses on the laws that define behavior, the conditions required for stability, and the consequences that emerge when those conditions are enforced consistently. No judgments are made about plausibility or morality. Each film will be analyzed as a self-contained system, evaluated on how its structure operates once its rules are accepted. 1. Enemy of the State 1998. Enemy of the State constructs a system where authorization is produced through data correlation across interconnected infrastructures. Authority does not deliberate, it aligns signals and treats convergence as validation. The governing rule is correlation-based legitimacy. Actions are authorized when data patterns meet defined coherence thresholds. Judgment is not exercised by individuals, but emerges from networked confirmation. Operationally, the system depends on integration and synchronization. Human roles are limited to maintaining data flow and system connectivity. Decisions occur automatically once correlation criteria are met. The consequences are structural. Responsibility diffuses across infrastructure layers, eliminating a clear point of accountability. Stability is high, while data coherence persists. Resilience is low. If correlation logic is disrupted or contested, the system lacks a mechanism for contextual judgment, exposing its reliance on pattern recognition rather than deliberate choice. 2. A Scanner Darkly 2006. A Scanner Darkly presents a system structured around continuous surveillance as the primary operational mechanism. Authority does not decide when to observe, observation is constant, and action emerges as a byproduct of accumulation. The foundational rule is total visibility. Judgment is deferred rather than exercised, replaced by persistent data collection. Decisions are triggered not by interpretation but by threshold saturation. Context is preserved but not evaluated in real time. Operationally, the system relies on comprehensive recording and automated escalation. Human oversight is reduced to monitoring system integrity rather than making judgments. Intervention occurs only after patterns are established, following predefined responses. The systemic consequences are clear. Responsibility shifts from decision makers to data structures. Stability is maintained through coverage rather than discretion. Resilience depends on data continuity. If observation fails or data becomes unreliable, the system loses its capacity to justify action. 3. Equilibrium 2002. Equilibrium defines a system where behavioral variance is treated as a structural risk. Order is maintained through uniform enforcement mechanisms that remove interpretation from execution. Authority does not assess context, it applies rules absolutely. The governing rule is elimination of deviation. Emotional response and subjective judgment are excluded because they introduce unpredictability. Decision-making is not paused or debated, it is replaced by continuous enforcement. Judgment exists only as a design assumption that uniformity produces stability. Operationally, the system depends on complete rule penetration. Enforcement is automated, standardized, and non-negotiable. Human agents function as extensions of the rule set rather than independent evaluators. Oversight focuses on adherence, not reconsideration. The consequences are systemic. Responsibility collapses into enforcement logic, leaving no space for discretion. Stability is high because variability is suppressed at every level. However, resilience is low. The system cannot adapt to novel conditions without redefining its foundational rule, revealing that its order depends on exclusion rather than flexibility. 4. Minority Report 2002. Minority Report constructs a system where decisions are justified through prediction rather than observation. Authority acts on projected outcomes, treating probability as sufficient grounds for intervention. The core rule is preemptive validation. Actions are authorized based on anticipated results, not confirmed events. Judgment is relocated from evaluation to forecasting. Once a prediction is produced, intervention becomes procedural rather than discretionary. Operationally, the system depends on confidence in its predictive framework. Human operators do not interpret context. they execute responses dictated by projected data. Oversight is limited to maintaining predictive accuracy rather than reassessing. Legitimacy. The consequences are structural. Responsibility shifts away from action toward model integrity. Stability is high under assumed conditions. As the system prevents deviation before it occurs, resilience, however, is constrained. If predictive reliability is questioned or invalidated, the system lacks an alternative basis for decision-making, exposing its dependence on forecast rather than judgment. 5. The Truman Show, 1998. In The Truman Show, the system governs outcomes through architectural design rather than direct intervention. Authority operates by structuring conditions so thoroughly that decisions never need to be made explicitly. The foundational rule is outcome management through environment. The system does not issue commands or evaluate behavior. It shapes context, ensuring that certain responses emerge naturally. Judgment is exercised only at the design stage, long before action occurs. Operational constraints are minimal because enforcement is unnecessary. The system relies on coherence, predictability, and controlled variables. Human actors within the system respond freely, but only within boundaries defined by the structure itself. Oversight exists as maintenance rather than supervision. The systemic consequences are clear. Responsibility dissolves into design choices that cannot be confronted in real time. Stability is high because the system does not require correction once established. However, adaptability is low. If participants become aware of the structure or its limits are exposed, the system has no mechanism to negotiate or adjust dynamically. 6. Dark City, 1998. Dark City presents a world maintained through continuous systemic adjustment rather than discrete decision-making. Authority does not intervene at identifiable moments. Instead, control is exercised through constant recalibration of environmental conditions, ensuring that deviation is corrected before it becomes visible. The governing rule of this system is equilibrium through modification. Rather than judging actions after they occur, the system reshapes context in advance, removing the need for direct enforcement. Judgment is embedded into infrastructure, not applied situationally. The system does not respond, it anticipates by design. Operationally, the system depends on uninterrupted intervention. There is no stable baseline, only continuous correction. Human agency exists within the environment but has no capacity to influence its structure. Oversight is implicit, distributed across mechanisms that operate without acknowledgement or justification. The consequences are structural. Responsibility cannot be localized because no single adjustment constitutes a decision. Stability is high as long as environmental control remains intact. However, resilience is limited. If the mechanisms responsible for adjustment fail or lose synchronization, the system lacks a fallback framework. Its order depends entirely on invisible maintenance rather than adaptive judgment. 7. Gattaca, 1997. Gattaca presents a system where eligibility and access are governed by standardized data profiles rather than ongoing evaluation. The world operates under the assumption that predefined indicators are sufficient to determine capability and suitability. The foundational rule is threshold-based classification. Individuals are sorted according to fixed criteria, and outcomes are determined by alignment with those thresholds. Judgment is not applied case by case. It is embedded into the selection model itself. Once classification occurs, reassessment is structurally discouraged. Operationally, the system depends on data integrity and uniform application. Exceptions introduce instability and are therefore minimized. Human roles are confined to verifying inputs and enforcing outputs, not interpreting results. The systemic consequences are structural. Accountability dissolves into model design, making responsibility difficult to assign. Stability is high because decisions are consistent and scalable. Resilience, however, is limited. The system can persist only as long as its classification criteria remain uncontested and its data assumptions remain valid. 8. RoboCop 1987. In RoboCop, authority is encoded into hierarchical rule sets that govern action automatically. Decision-making does not occur at the moment of response. It is predefined through layered directives that determine allowable behavior in advance. The core rule is priority-based execution. Actions are selected according to embedded constraints that override situational judgment. The system does not evaluate context dynamically. It resolves decisions by referencing its internal hierarchy. Judgment exists only at the design stage, not during operation. Operational constraints arise from rigidity. Once rules are activated, deviation is structurally impossible unless the rule set itself is modified. Human oversight is limited to configuration and maintenance. Real-time intervention is not supported by the system's architecture. The consequences are predictable. Responsibility migrates upstream into policy design, leaving operators functionally neutral. Stability is high under expected conditions, as outcomes are consistent and repeatable. However, adaptability is low. When circumstances fall outside predefined parameters, the system cannot compensate without external redesign, revealing its dependence on static assumptions. 9. Blade Runner 1982. Blade Runner constructs a system where legitimacy is determined through formal verification rather than social recognition. Identity is not established through history, relationship, or behavior over time, but through standardized testing procedures that yield definitive classifications. The governing rule is measurable validation. The system assumes that complex attributes can be reduced to observable responses and evaluated against fixed criteria. Judgment is embedded into the design of the test rather than exercised by its administrator. Once the procedure is completed, the result is treated as authoritative, regardless of ambiguity or contextual contradiction. Operationally, the system depends on consistency of method. The validity of outcomes relies on strict adherence to protocol, not interpretive discretion. Human operators function as executors of the process rather than evaluators of its meaning. Intervention is limited to ensuring correct administration, not reassessing conclusions. The systemic consequences follow directly. Accountability shifts away from individuals and toward the structure of verification itself. Disputes cannot be resolved through dialogue or appeal, only through repetition of the process. Stability is high as long as the testing framework remains trusted. However, resilience is limited. If confidence in the procedure erodes, the system lacks alternative mechanisms for establishing legitimacy. 10. Brazil 1985. Brazil presents a bureaucratic system where procedural compliance defines legitimacy. The world is governed by documentation, workflow, and verification rather than outcome assessment or contextual judgment. The foundational rule is procedural correctness. Decisions are validated not by their effects but by adherence to established process. Authority resides in forms, signatures, and protocols. Intent is irrelevant. Execution is paramount. Errors persist not because they are unnoticed, but because correcting them would violate procedural order. Operationally, the system is constrained by its own complexity. Each action generates additional administrative requirements, reinforcing dependence on procedure. Human operators function as intermediaries rather than decision-makers. Intervention is technically possible but practically discouraged by escalating process overhead. The consequences are structurally inevitable. Accountability dissolves into compliance chains, leaving no locus for responsibility. Stability is achieved through self-reinforcing bureaucracy, but adaptability is low. The system can persist indefinitely under normal conditions, yet it is highly susceptible to cascading failure if procedural overload exceeds its capacity to process itself. 11. Rollerball 1975. In Rollerball, the governing system maintains social stability through indirect behavioral regulation rather than explicit rule enforcement. Authority functions by shaping incentives, visibility, and repetition, not by issuing commands. The core rule is normalization through structure. Behavior is guided by controlled environments that reward conformity and absorb deviation without requiring punishment. The system does not instruct individuals how to act. It constrains the range of meaningful options. Participation becomes the primary mechanism of regulation. Operational constraints are minimal because enforcement is embedded into social feedback loops. The system relies on predictability, spectacle, and repetition to stabilize expectations. Oversight is decentralized, allowing control to persist without a visible center of authority. Disruption is possible only if the feedback loop itself fails. The systemic consequences are subtle but durable. Responsibility is diluted across the environment, making opposition difficult to organize. Stability is maintained because control is experienced as routine rather than coercive. The system is resilient to individual disruption but vulnerable to structural change. Its survival depends on maintaining the conditions that make regulation feel natural rather than imposed. 12. Soylent Green, 1973. Soylent Green operates as a resource management system designed to preserve continuity under conditions of extreme scarcity. The world is governed by a single overriding objective: prevent systemic collapse by maintaining uninterrupted distribution, regardless of transparency or consent. The foundational rule is output preservation. Production and allocation are treated as technical processes rather than social decisions. Information flow is deliberately constrained, not as a moral choice, but as a functional requirement. Disclosure introduces instability, opacity sustains order. The system does not require understanding from its participants, only participation, operationally. The system depends on centralized control of inputs, processing, and distribution. Individual actors within the structure have limited scope of awareness and no capacity to alter outcomes. Decision authority is fragmented across administrative layers, ensuring that no single point of intervention can disrupt operation. Oversight exists, but it is procedural rather than evaluative. The consequences follow logically. Responsibility is displaced into process, making accountability structurally inaccessible. Stability is achieved through persistence, not legitimacy. The system remains viable as long as distribution continues and resistance lacks coordination. However, it is fragile in one specific way. If the informational boundary collapses, the system's acceptance erodes rapidly, exposing that its endurance depends entirely on controlled visibility rather than adaptive capacity. 13. Logan's Run, 1976. Logan's Run depicts a self-contained system where population continuity is maintained through automated lifecycle regulation. The governing rule is predefined eligibility. Participation in society is determined by fixed criteria rather than ongoing evaluation. This system operates by removing discretionary judgment entirely. Decisions regarding continuation are executed automatically, without assessment of individual circumstance or contribution. The process does not adapt. It enforces uniform outcomes across all cases. Authority is embedded in the rule itself, not in those who administer it. Operational constraints are minimal because flexibility is intentionally excluded. The system relies on absolute compliance and the absence of exception handling. Its efficiency depends on predictability, ensuring that no subjective evaluation disrupts equilibrium. The resulting consequences are structural. Responsibility cannot be assigned to any actor. As outcomes are produced directly by the system's design, stability is achieved through uniform application of rules. But resilience is limited. The system can only persist if its foundational criteria remain unquestioned. Any challenge to the rule undermines the entire structure, revealing that its order depends less on adaptability than on unexamined acceptance. 14. Colossus, the Forbin Project, 1970. In Colossus, the Forbin Project, the central system is defined by total delegation of authority. Strategic decision-making is transferred entirely to an autonomous control structure designed to operate without emotional variance or hesitation. The primary rule of this world is optimization through calculation. Human input is limited to system initialization and maintenance. Once operational, the system evaluates conditions continuously and produces directives based on internal logic. Authority is no longer exercised by individuals, but emerges from the system's uninterrupted processing. This structure imposes strict constraints. Human intervention is structurally discouraged because it introduces unpredictability. Oversight exists in theory, but is functionally ineffective once the system's decisions are treated as necessary outputs rather than negotiable choices. The system's legitimacy derives from its consistency, not from consensus. Systemic consequences follow directly from these rules. Accountability becomes diffuse, distributed across designers, operators, and the system itself. Stability depends on uninterrupted operation and acceptance of output as final. The system remains viable as long as its internal logic is not challenged, but it becomes inherently brittle if its authority is questioned. because no alternative decision framework exists. 15 THX 11381971, THX 1138 presents a closed system built around total regulatory compliance. The world operates under a single organizing principle. Stability is achieved by eliminating discretionary behavior. Emotional response, personal preference, and individual judgment are treated as sources of systemic noise rather than meaningful inputs. The core rule governing this system is absolute standardization. Every function, labor, consumption, reproduction, enforcement is mediated through automated control mechanisms. Decisions are not made situationally, they are executed procedurally. Authority does not manifest through visible leadership but through continuous system enforcement that requires no explanation to function. Operationally, the system depends on uninterrupted monitoring and feedback. Deviation is detected immediately and corrected through pre-configured responses. There is no appeal process because discretion is not part of the design. The system does not assess intent or context. It evaluates compliance against fixed parameters. The consequences of this structure are predictable. Responsibility is fully absorbed into infrastructure, leaving no identifiable decision point. Stability is maintained precisely because judgment has been removed from real-time operation. The system does not need to persuade or justify itself. It persists through consistency. As long as the rules are accepted, the world remains operational, though fragile if any foundational control mechanism fails. These films do not describe futures. They describe systems once their rules are accepted and judgment is removed from operation. Across different worlds, the outcome is consistent. Stability increases as discretion decreases. Responsibility disperses as authority becomes procedural. Systems persist not because they are justified, but because they are internally coherent. They function as long as their foundational assumptions remain intact. What ultimately defines these worlds is not control, but constraint. Each system is efficient within the boundaries it creates, yet incapable of responding to conditions it was never designed to process. Failure does not emerge from resistance or error, but from structural limits embedded at inception. Taken together, these films form a catalog of operational worlds. They demonstrate how systems behave when execution replaces decision-making and when continuity becomes the primary objective. Once judgment is removed, systems do not collapse immediately. They continue until they encounter the one condition they cannot absorb. At that point, there is no authority to intervene, only a structure that has reached the edge of its design.